Welcome. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to see everyone. I mean, this is phenomenal. We got more people than registered, so those that came in at the last minute, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here this evening. Before we begin, a couple opportunities just to recognize some of the folks with us here in person and at home. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors in the audience? Well, maybe they're at home. Let's give them a round of applause. I would note for folks around the museum later this week, we have 20 Rosie the Riveters coming here to the museum, so it'll be an incredibly special opportunity to honor them as well. So pretty cool. It's a pretty cool opportunity. How about any veterans or active duty service members or armed forces from any era? Would you stand or wave and be recognized? Thank you for your service, and of course, none of their service is possible without the support of their family members. So family members of veterans or active duty, would you please stand or be recognized as well? Thank you all for your service and the sacrifice it entails. Also, programs like this aren't possible without the support of our Patriot Circle and charter members. Any Patriot Circle and charter members here tonight, would you also be recognized? Thank you very much for what you do. So for those at home, none of this would be possible without their generous support. Now tonight we're excited to have Dr. Robin Judd here to speak on her award-winning book, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. Robin's a professor at The Ohio State University. Had to get that right? She teaches courses in Holocaust studies, the history of anti-Semitism, and the history of leadership. In addition to Between Two Worlds, she's also the author of Contested Rituals. In recognition of her work in Holocaust studies, Robin was appointed to Ohio's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial Education Commission in both 2001 and 2024. She's also the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the vice chair of the Leo Baeck Institute's Faculty Advisory Board. So very impressive credentials. I think you'll find we have an incredible historian here this evening. Also on stage with Robin, interviewing her this evening, is a member of our own team, Haley Gopay. She's a research fellow here at the Jenny Craig Institute. Now, she's in the final days, literally, of completing her PhD requirements at the University of Aberdeen. Along the way, though, she's also got an LSU undergrad for those local folks and a law degree from Loyola. So, no one better than the local attorney to question the historian for our topic here this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's join me in a warm welcome for Haley Gopay and Robin Judd. Haley, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mike, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, all of you, for being here tonight, and thank you, Robin, especially for joining us. I think we have a really great conversation ahead of us tonight. So I did a quick Google search about Jewish war brides and Between Two Worlds, and your book is the only thing that comes up. So you've quite literally written the book. So I guess let's start at the beginning. How did you come to write about Jewish war brides? I know your grandmother met and married an American soldier after liberation. Was she your inspiration?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let me see if I can make this work. There we go. Is it doing anything? There you go. Oops, but wait, now it went. Let's go back. There we are. Okay, perfect. So you can see I'm directionally challenged. So the photograph that has a woman in a fabulous looking sweater that looks slightly like me That is a photograph of my grandmother's Americanization class. My grandmother was a war bride, and I knew that growing up. I knew that she had married the man that I knew as my grandfather, that she met in the immediate aftermath of the war. She and my father were the only survivors from their family, and when the war ended and my grandmother and father eventually made their way to Humana, several months later, my grandfather, Joe, arrived. And I tell the story of their meeting and marriage in the conclusion of the book. My grandmother never wanted to talk about her experience, as she sort of would talk about her life up to about 1942, when my father was born, and then she sort of picked up again in 1950. And when she described her marriage, she always described being a war bride as unusual, that being a Jewish war bride was unique. And I would try to interview her and to talk about her marrying my grandfather, or her experiences on the ship, or even her earlier experiences hiding with my father and my grandfather in the forests of Slovakia, and she refused to talk about it. And one of the things that we learn as historians, really as anyone who does oral history, is that when your subject sort of pushes back and tells you that they are no longer interested in speaking, then you stop. And so I sort of put the story of my grandmother to the side. And it was really only later, when I began teaching the history of the Holocaust at The Ohio State University, where I started to introduce memoirs that were written by women. And the first memoir that I introduced to my students was a memoir that I loved, and it's a memoir written by a woman whose interview is included in the Liberation exhibit here at the museum. I was delighted to see, and that's Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life. It was one of my favorite memoirs when I was a high schooler and in early college, and I had kind of forgotten about it. And I went back to the memoir, and she ends the memoir just as she does with her interview here, with meeting the man that she will marry at Liberation. And the following year, I wanted to I like to introduce my students to historical actors in multiple places. So the following year, I introduced one of the first memoirs published in England by a Jewish female survivor, and that is Gina Turgel's I Light a Candle. And lo and behold, she ends the memoir at Liberation in Bergen-Belsen, meeting the man that she's going to marry. And a light bulb goes off in my head, and I realize that there are these stories of these Jewish survivors who meet and marry American, British, and Canadian military men. And indeed, the first memoir published in Canada by a female survivor is that of Alicia Rose, The Tulips Are Red, and so on and so forth. And I include here, too, a photograph of Hannah Kohner. She is the first Holocaust survivor introduced on the television show This Is Your Life. This Is Your Life introduces 3 survivors, 2 of whom were war brides. Hannah Kohner, and then the second war bride, a male war bride. And you could be a male war bride. The verbiage was gendered, but the category was not. So you could be a male war bride. And indeed, there's a great 1946 movie, I Was a Male War Bride, that stars Cary Grant. Nothing to do with Jews, but totally worth watching. So I became really interested in the topic. And indeed, I asked some of the military historians at Ohio State, including Alan Millett, who's now decamped and moved to New Orleans 20 years ago, is there stuff on this? They sort of directed me to the literature on war brides. And it's an amazing literature, but it has nothing to do with Jews. It really overlooks the question of religion altogether. And so I began to think about it as a next project. I assumed I would write an article, and then I'd go to this next book project that I had envisioned. And indeed, that next book project has kind of evaporated into the ether. And many years later, I wrote Between Two Worlds, which was this sort of story of what happens with these Jewish survivors who meet and marry these military personnel. Like, how is it that they meet, and what does their courtships look like, and what is the kind of immigration story, and so that's what became this book.
Wow. The stories that these couples are experiencing are so complex, they're so rich, as are, I'm sure, the stories of the people that you didn't include in the book. How did you choose which couples to include?
That was really, really hard. And I found it incredibly difficult when I sort of went into writing the book, figuring out how it was that I was going to actually kind of tell the narrative, but also include all of the stories. And at some point I had to sort of make peace with the fact that I wasn't going to include all the stories. Because what I really wanted to do was to tell the stories in a way that was going to be accessible to people who are not academics. Like, I wanted the book to matter to academics. Don't get me wrong, I was getting promoted for, and that was important. But it was really important that the family members of the people that I had spent so much time with would want to read the book. And so that meant thinking about the book, writing about the book differently. And so what I ended up doing, and hopefully I can make this work, I'm geographically challenged and I'm technically challenged. So what I ended up doing was to imagine every chapter being really grounded in two couples whose stories were different enough that they would be able to, just by kind of using them as a way of kind of grounding each chapter, that just by telling their stories, I could kind of demonstrate the global nature of their stories, the commonalities and the differences. So how did I end up choosing them? Well, first of all, I would only choose couples where I had a lot of literature. So where there were interviews, where they appeared in chaplaincy materials, where there were contemporary letters, where there was photographic evidence. Like, I really wanted to have enough that I could kind of rest a good chunk of the book on them. And second, I wanted to make sure that they were different enough, because I was telling this global story, right? People who go to the United States, people who go to Britain, people who go to Canada, but who originate in different spots. So I give you here an example of two couples that I use in the first chapter. And in many ways, I love these two couples because I kind of almost knew of them before I had started the book, but I didn't realize that I had known of them. So Flori and Harry Jagoda, some of you may be familiar with Flori Jagoda. She was a very well-known Ladino folk singer. And if anyone's children or grandchildren here or in the audience has ever sung the Ocho Candelicas song during the holiday of Hanukkah, that was Flori Jagoda. So when I went to interview her, at the time, my younger son thought it was like unbelievable. Like, I was going to interview the Ocho Candelicas singer. And Sala and Abe Bonder were the owners of Bonder's Books, which was a well-known bookstore in Montreal, kind of close to McGill. It was sort of a student hangout, and sometimes would be kind of a place that people would go and students would go. And Flori begins her story in Sarajevo. That's where she's born. She grows up in Zagreb. And when the Germans invade Yugoslavia, she and her mother and stepfather go to Split. And in Split, they're forcibly deported to the island of Korsela. And eventually, she and her mother are brought by partisans to Bari, and then later her stepfather follows. It's in Bari that she meets Harry, an American soldier from Youngstown, Ohio. Sala begins her life in Serac, Poland. So really, at the time that Flori experiences her liberation in Bari, Sala is on her 36th month of confinement. Because she flees with her family to Warsaw in 1939, where she is imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she eventually is in the DP camp, where she meets Abe, a Canadian soldier. And so for me, like those two couples were really useful tools of telling a story of people who begin in really different places, who have different languages. Flory speaks 5 or 6 languages in 1944. None of them are English, and none of them are Yiddish. So the fact that Harry speaks Yiddish is of no help for her. She speaks Ladino. Sala is from Poland. She actually does have Yiddish, and that's how she and Abe communicate. So that was sort of how I went to choose the couples. And at the time, I would have, I mean, I'm still kind of old school, right? And I would have these index cards and pictures all over my office. And I would just kind of put people in piles, and then I would move them around and move them around and move them around until I kind of found a way of constructing a narrative that was true to the story I wanted to tell.
Early on, you mentioned that liberation is the moment that some of these war brides and war grooms begin to acknowledge the enormity of their losses of their family, their friends, and they feel grief intertwined with relief at liberation. Can you talk about some of these opposite feelings that these people are experiencing in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust?
Yeah, it's such an important question, this question about how it is that liberation is a kind of complicated, complex moment in time. And indeed, you know, it was amazing to spend the morning in the liberation exhibit, because I think it gets at some of these kind of really complex moments. When I sort of started as a graduate student in European history and Holocaust history, we learned liberation as a sort of wonderful time, right? Like this incredible moment. And that's not to take away from that. But rather, I think in the last decade or so, historians have really tried to complicate that moment of liberation. Like, how could liberation on the one, as Gerda Klein and others in the videos discussed, how could it on the one be like the most amazing moment, right? The most incredible moment of somebody's life, and on the other, be this moment where all of a sudden they realize how alone they are. And I wish I remembered, and I have it on my phone, but I'm not gonna get up and go over there. But one of the videos that you included, right, he talks about this, about, you know, he says it was this amazing moment, and then he stops and he gets all teary and he said, and all of a sudden I realized I was alone, right? That liberation is that moment where on the one they are freed, and on the other they begin to recognize the enormity of their loss, and it's not just, if you will, as if there needed to just be a just, right? It's not just that there's that paradox, but also, right, depending on where they are at liberation, there are going to be all these other sort of policies in place that are going to affect whether or not they can leave on their own. You know, will they need to undergo certain kinds of treatment? How long will they need to stay in place, right? How will they actually physically go from place to place? What kinds of clothes might they be able to wear, right? And so all of this is sort of part of and integrated into that story that I try to tell.
Do you think any of these couples felt guilty about falling in love in the midst of all of this horror around them?
They do. I mean, and you asked earlier about how I choose these couples. Part of what I wanted to make sure I had wasn't just how people remembered their past, and that's very important, but also what's happening on the ground. Like, what materials might I have from that time period that would reflect some of that? And so Gerda and Kurt are a great example, where Gerda and Kurt Klein wrote to each other for years, because it takes a very long time until she's able to leave Europe, and they marry in Paris and eventually come to the United States, to Buffalo, where Kurt Klein was living at the time. But throughout that period, really from the moment that they meet, they begin writing to one another. And at first, Kurt is in Europe, Eventually he's demobilized, so they're writing to each other when she's in the sanitarium. They're writing to each other when he moves her to Munich to be close by him. They write to each other after he learns of his demobilization and he wants to go and kind of retrace the steps of where his family had been. And those letters are so painful, but so unbelievable to read, because Kurt, as a refugee soldier, is at this point totally aware of what has happened to his family. And he writes to Gerda and he says things like, "You more than anyone else will understand. Right? You understand what happened to my sister. You understand what happened to my mother." And Gerda, similarly, is writing to Kurt saying, "I don't know if anyone's alive. I don't know what's happened to my brother," right? And so they're writing to each other about loss. They know of some details, but those details are coming in. And that is absolutely something that follows these couples throughout their early years, right? That they know when they're having children, when their children begin to grow, right? All of these sorts of questions, they kind of are also, they're beginning to get that information about who they've lost, because as we know, it's not all information, it doesn't sort of get handed down at that moment of 1945. All of that gets really trickled in slowly.
On maybe a lighter note, these couples how are they meeting? We have American, Canadian, and British soldiers meeting survivor women. Where are they meeting? How are they communicating with each other?
Let me see. So let's kind of talk about maybe Florrie and Sala. And here we have just an image of Florrie's sort of movement. So Florrie is an incredibly talented young woman who, when she arrives in Bari with her family, realizes quickly that they do not want to be in the displaced persons camp. And so she looks for work. She's very attractive. She's able to get work in the sort of depot, the supply depot that is part of one of the British bases that's in Bari. And she meets Harry because he comes to the base. He has sort of an equivalent position in the American military. The American forces have come basically by the airfields that are outside of Bari, and he shows up at the supply depot. He sees Florrie, and he is an American GI who is, trying to meet adorable looking women, and she rebuffs him because she's really quite wary about sexual violence, and she sort of pushes him, she rebuffs him, and he finally gets her permission to go talk to her parents. And it's when he goes to her apartment, and it's the Jewish holidays in the fall, he sees a machzor, the prayer book that one would use during the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and with a translator and kind of in various broken, like English, Yiddish, Italian, he asks them if they're Jews, and they tell him that they are, and they allow him to take Florrie to a dance, but only if they accompany, and they actually chaperone Florrie and Harry on many of their dates. If we look at Sala, and here you have Sala's sort of journey as well, and you can see, and I mean the map always just, whenever I look at her forced movements, right, you can see the zigzags, and that wasn't uncommon, right, of being moved all over the place. Sala had, at the war's end, she was liberated by the Russians in Saxony, and after a I mean, she kind of had known that she wanted to go to Berlin, and this was made all the more the case after a friend, one of the women that she had been on the death march with that also had survived, was assaulted by a Russian soldier. And so she and a group of friends, once that friend recovers, make their way to Berlin. They worry that Berlin will not be safe for them, and so they go into the British zone to Hanover, where they've heard that there are other survivors from their town of Serach and Warsaw. The group of women were all Polish women. They go to Hanover. And in the summer of 1945, she tries to leave illegally and go to Palestine at the time. Palestine was part of the British Mandate. It wasn't yet the State of Israel. That happens in 1948. So she tries to go illegally. She's caught at the border and returned to Hanover. And so by the time the Jewish holidays of the fall roll around, she is in no mood whatsoever to meet with any of the forces, any of the military, any of the aid workers that come to Hanover. In fact, she would say later that she hated when people came to the DP camps because she said that they made her feel like people visiting monkeys in the zoo. And that she didn't want to be on display. She didn't want to be seen as unique. She just wanted to be left alone and to mourn. And Abe, the Canadian soldier who, everywhere he went, would try to meet other Jews, he had gone for services, Rosh Hashanah, and he wanted to go to the DP camp for services, worship services, and he sees Salah, and he goes and sits down and starts talking to her in Yiddish. He was the son of a butcher, a Jewish butcher. He spoke Yiddish at home with his parents and in his father's store. And so he started to talk to her in Yiddish, and they develop a friendship, and about a couple of weeks later, he is told that he's about to be demobilized, and he asks permission to marry her, and because he knows, right, that he's about to leave Europe, and he proposes, but the problem is, at the time, the Canadian policy was that one could not marry on German soil. It didn't matter whether or not one was the victim of the Nazis. And so he has to return to Canada without her. And so they have this whole long kind of period until they're able to marry. And that was something else that I loved about putting those two couples side by side, because Harry's in Italy, and there are some, but very minimal, non-fraternization policies in place. He has no trouble engaging with Flore and her family when he decides, when he gets demobilized, he proposes, they're able to marry, and we can talk about what marriage, how that works. But it's very different when we look at Salah. And so some of what I wanted to do was how to tell the stories of all of these different marriage laws depending on time and place without kind of boring somebody to death. And so kind of putting these couples side by side allows me to do that.
How did some of the families and friends of the survivors feel about their loved one meeting an Allied soldier and getting engaged or marrying them?
So it really, it depends on who we're talking about and what family members. One of the realities of this period was that if a couple is given permission to marry, and that was no sure thing, that individual would be essentially given permission to immigrate. That the US, Britain, and Canada all have immigration legislation that circumvents any kind of existing quota system. And so there are many perks of being involved with a member of the Allied military personnel. The biggest one is immigration, but there are others. There's better food, there's better housing depending on where one is. There might be the opportunity to have a job. So if a survivor is lucky enough to have family members who are still alive, and that's a big if. I often see in those materials of the family members some ambivalence, and I mean that in the kind of real meaning of the term, that on the one, right, there's the possibility that they're going to be able to get chicken or oranges or bread or fuel. But on the other, there's kind of concerns about what does this mean for the reputation of their daughter or son, what will the chances be for this individual? So we have kind of that on the survivor story. For my military personnel, in many cases, their family members are quite nervous about what's unfolding. And in some cases, will send letters pushing their children to rethink, maybe to wait and get married in the US, Britain, or Canada, and not to get married in Europe. Ask a lot of questions about the family, will ask for the chaplain to send back materials to the potential groom's home about what the chaplain has found when he interviews the girl or boy, but often it's girl. And so sometimes they'll remind the soldier that there's a girlfriend waiting at home. So what happened to this woman or that woman, or and in many cases they're part of the same community, right? So one of the couples that I look at, he's left a very serious girlfriend back in Philadelphia that the parents over the last couple of years have been having Shabbat dinner with on Friday nights, right? And they're saying, well, what are we going to tell her, right, when she comes over on Friday night? Do we say that he's met somebody new and sorry? Like, are we the ones that are supposed to? So it's very complicated, and that's part of the story that I try to tell.
Speaking of complicated, when the couples get together, and speaking of immigration, it's not always smooth sailing, and I do intend that pun a little bit. Many of them are denied entry, or they're delayed, or they're detained on the way to their new homes. Can you talk a little bit about these challenges that they're facing, sometimes unsuccessfully going to their new homes, their new lives?
Yeah, so one of the things that really fascinated me about the stories of these war brides was the ways in which they're going to experience the military policies and procedures. They're going to be in spaces that are going to put them alongside often individuals that they may identify as perpetrators. So perhaps they're going to be on French ships with French non-Jewish women who perhaps they even know had been collaborators. And so there's the immigration story kind of continues the messiness of it all. So for the United States and Canada, for those war brides, the families, the military personnel had a choice. They could either take advantage of the public opportunities for the military to cover the war bride immigration process, or the military personnel could arrange for private immigration. Most couples took advantage of the war bride ships, and that's what they were referred to. The war bride ships, on the whole, weren't only populated by war brides, but they were ships that the US and Canadian militaries, along with the Red Cross, had re-outfitted so that they could take war brides and potentially their dependents from the various war bride processing centers, and there are a couple of them in Europe, to the US and Canada. And so one experiences a second set of medical procedures. So there's an examination. One's papers are again sort of checked. One could be in the processing center for several days or a week, and it depended on where you were leaving from. And then you would go on these ships, and you would make the journey. It was much easier, of course, to go from France to Britain than it was to go from France to the United States or to Canada. And there was a lot of nervousness about some of these ships, particularly when they were the Liberty ships, and there was a lot of rumors around the problems that some of these Liberty ships were undergoing. And so that's like part of that immigration story. The other part is the part that you allude to, which is that for some of the women and men, but it's women in this case, for some of the women where their immigration, where first the marriage is approved and then the immigration is approved, as we move into the latter part of the 1940s, particularly around 47 or 48, if these women originated in Eastern Europe or if their husbands were known communists, then it was not unusual for them to be detained as they moved towards the US or Canada or Britain, or in some cases excluded, meaning that they're not allowed to leave that processing center and come to the US or to Canada. And indeed, one of the famous Supreme Court cases, and I write about it in the book, is a story of a German Jewish war bride, Ellen Knauf, who is detained at Ellis Island. And there's a question about whether or not she had kind of colluded with the charges with the Czechs and then the charges with the Soviets. She's on Ellis Island long enough that the charges can kind of grow and develop over time. But it becomes one of the key cases in immigration law. And again, it's part of the story of these Jewish war brides, but we don't think about it that way.
Do you think that, were there any like agents that you came across in your research? You mentioned, immigration was a little nervous about bringing these foreign women into the country. Did you come across any agents in your research?
So no, I read a lot of surveillance materials, and this is where the freedom of information appeals was something that I spent a fair bit of time doing. And at least in the materials that I was looking at, so of these Jewish women, there were some who absolutely were married to men who were card-carrying communists, but many of them did not have deeply ideological lives. Many of them were, came of age in the camps or in hiding or in the ghettos. And so in looking at their interviews and other materials, it's hard to imagine them. I mean, some of them may have belonged to Jewish kind of socialist movements as teens, as early teens at 11 or 12 or 13 before the war breaks out. But when they're grilled about kind of tenets of the ideology, they're pretty slippery. So that, I don't see it, but I do see it in the concern, right? And there's a lot of material, particularly in the Truman archives, around the FBI's concern that these Soviet spies are sort of taking advantage of innocent American, British, and Canadian soldiers, using their sexual, prowess and somehow seducing them into marrying them. But there isn't real, I haven't found any of these individuals who then kind of become part of the Communist Party. It's a kind of a slight exception. She isn't, but Friedel Rosenthal, who I write about in the second to last chapter of the book, she's one of these people who's not allowed to come to the United States. And she goes to Britain, where her sister lives. Her sister had been a member of part of the Kindertransport, a group of teens who are able to leave in 1938 and 1939. So she goes to Britain to be reunited with her sister. At the time, she has a child that her husband will later, the man that will become her husband, it's his child as well, but they're not married yet. And he was involved in the Communist Party here in the United States, involved in the anti-fascist movement when serving in Europe. In his early years, when he goes to London, and in fact he goes to London to marry her, is still unable to bring her to the United States, and so they live in Britain. And I just actually spent a couple of weeks in London looking at all of their materials, and he is involved in kind of the Communist Party when he first comes to London, and he becomes very quickly kind of disabused as he begins to learn more and more about what is happening in the Soviet Union. And so his letters are so awful to read, because here he is, somebody who had been a believer as a young man, who helps to liberate the camps. So he just, the things that he sees, right? And he goes to London, eventually he's able to marry Friedel, and his world falls apart, right? Like all that he believes in, it kind of turns into dust, and he writes about that in these like just painful letters to the State Department, begging them to allow him and his now wife and daughter to come to the United States, and he's repeatedly refused admission. And so, you know, I found those kinds of cases
Sure.
in the files.
So once these war brides and grooms make it to their final destinations, what challenges are they facing in these new communities?
They face a lot of challenges. They face a lot of challenges in these new cases. So let's look at Lala and Morris as a good example. So first of all, many of them have had serious difficulties just in communicating with their future spouses or spouses. In the case of Lala and Morris, they're able to communicate in Yiddish. He has Yiddish, and so he like Abe, has grown up in a Yiddish-speaking household. But there's so much that is completely unfamiliar to her. So she arrives, she's living like much of the Great Generation, right? They come back from war and they can't buy their own homes, right? They can't rent their own apartments. There's a housing shortage. And so they're living with their parents. They're living with their siblings. And that's the case with Morris, right? He and Lala arrive in New York, and they actually fly. So they land in LaGuardia Airport, and they move to Morris's parents' Brooklyn home. And I don't know what any of your relationships are like with your in-laws, and I love my in-laws. In fact, they may be zooming in and watching this right now. So I will say I love my in-laws. But right, most of us don't really want to be living with our in-laws. And I mean, exceptions. I'm sure there are exceptions. But you know, most of us don't want to be living with our in-laws, and especially in those cases where the in-laws have been having the Friday night dinners, right, with the other girlfriends, and you know, are part of those communities. And in Lala and Morris's case, they're able to communicate, but their religious customs are a little bit different, right? Morris's parents are much more observant than Lala and Morris were. She looks at Morris's sisters, who are also living there, and they have, you know, multiple outfits, and she has, you know, one suitcase with very few clothing, right? The foods are unfamiliar. Many of these survivors have all kinds of gastrointestinal diseases that have stayed with them, and so they really can't just kind of eat what's being given to them, and yet, right, they're trying. And so it's the early years are really complicated years. And one thing that becomes very clear in the interviews and in the materials that I look at is that it's only once these couples are able to kind of move into their own apartments or homes and begin kind of that life. And Morris, you know, leaves New York and goes west. He goes to the Midwest first to become a Hillel director, and then and rabbi, and then social worker in the Chicago area. But it's going to take them a while until they kind of find their own home, and that's something that I see over and over again in the materials, that they're kind of stuck in between, and this is where some of the title comes from, between these multiple worlds of they're living with their in-laws, and there's that world. There are war bride kind of communities and all kinds of programs available for war brides, but those are intended for the 200,000 in the American case and tens of thousands in the Canadian-British case, Protestant, English-speaking war brides. And so, yes, they can take advantage, and Lala she goes and she tries to take advantage of some of the childcare and other things, but it's being taught in languages that she doesn't understand, and the images on the booklets are of these like blonde of women holding blonde babies, and that's kind of unfamiliar. So there's that, and then there are the survivor communities that often, and Lala and Morris are a bit of the exception, often the groom's family are not necessarily part and parcel of survivor communities. And so these war brides are kind of in between all of these different worlds.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. What do you hope that readers will take away from Between Two Worlds?
So it was really important to me that readers take away the kind of another way of thinking about the history of the Holocaust. Like for me, that was one part of writing this book, was that there are multiple ways of approaching and studying the Holocaust, and as historians, right, we're constantly learning these new avenues of exploration. And so for me, that was one piece that was really important. But there was another story as I was writing of resilience that became so important to me, that in reading the materials that are coming out of the war brides or out of the veteran spouses, military spouses, right? These are individuals, these are families where they have witnessed unbelievable trauma, right? The one set of the couple has experienced war and are kind of creating families in the aftermath of witnessing that, and one set is these survivors, right? And yet we see this story of resilience, of identifying ways of creating home and community. And for me, that was a really important and kind of inspirational takeaway.
Robin, thank you so very much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll start right here in the back. Here you go, sir.
Did many of them marry non-Jewish men?
Could you tell me your name?
Paul.
Paul, thank you. And I often say, right, when we study any kind of history of othering where people are trying to strip away humanity, it's important, Paul, for me to have a name with a face. So thank you. So the question was about endogamous marriage. So on the whole, yes, many of these survivors are marrying Jews. There are exceptions, and Friedel Rosenthal is a great example of an exception. She marries James Belota. But some of that has to do with the role of chaplains during this marriage vetting process, that really through about halfway of the Korean War, chaplains are part of the vetting process. So if a military personnel wants to marry, he or she can't just go off, right, and get married in their local synagogue or church. They need to have their commander's approval. As you might imagine, there are a couple of things going on during wartime or occupation. And so that interview process rests with the chaplain. And with most chaplains, they are going to deter an interfaith marriage. So many of our marriages, not all, but many in the Second World War are like to like. So Protestants marrying Protestants, Catholics marrying Catholics, Jews marrying Jews. Again, there are exceptions to the rule. But on the whole, many of these Jewish survivors are going to marry Jews, and there potentially could be a whole nother book, right, on the marriages that weren't, right? And in fact, the chaplaincy materials are filled with the chaplains saying, you know, I've gotten this panicked telegram from this woman in Choose Your Favorite City, right, about her son who is dating Choose Your Favorite Place, right? And then the chaplains would have a serious sort of talk with the soldier or officer in some cases about endogamous marriage or ex-dominus marriage, you know, what happens if it's out of interfaith. And so there's a lot of material around that. But on the whole, yes, Paul, many of these survivors are marrying Jewish military personnel.
Next question will stay in the back.
Thank you, and thank you, Robin, for the talk. I don't know if you remember, but my name is Elliot. Yeah, great.
Right, 2 L's, 2 T's, I remember.
Awesome. All right, we're really getting somewhere. Maybe I'm trying to race to the end of the book before I get there, but even if it's just within the Jewish community, how many of these marriages, like statistically, like stayed happy? Like were they like, I don't know about like if there were like formal divorces or separation, but of the war brides you either study or are familiar with, how successful were the marriages long after the immigration process was done?
So it's a great question. So Elliot asked about, right, the kind of success of these marriages, and as I often say, for those of us who are married, right, marriage is wonderful, but it's also really difficult. And all the more, right, when we're looking at a period where divorce is seriously frowned upon, and where these women and some men, but most of our war brides are women, have nowhere to go, right? And one fascinating moment that takes place in the late 40s and early 50s is that the Red Cross and Maple Club begin to kind of either subsidize or fully fund the return of war brides who find themselves, let's say, in Saskatchewan, nothing against Saskatchewan, but you know, find themselves in Saskatchewan, but having grown up in London and are miserable and they want to go home. We don't really see any of the survivors doing that. Like, they're not going back to Lodz, right? They're not going back to Europe. There's nothing for them to go back to. And so certainly I have some cases, very few of them, of divorce in the 50s. I have one case of divorce in the late 40s, but most of these couples stay married. And what we mean by successful marriage, it's hard for me to say, but certainly I'm struck by the ways in which they create stories about how they meet and what their meeting looked like. And I write about this a little bit in the book, and Haley and I were talking about an article that I have coming out soon that looks at this, right? These couples have to make sense of their origin story, and that's not an easy origin story to make sense of, right? It's different than a couple that meets at a dance, right? They're remembering something that's pretty horrific, and one of the things that I find really fascinating is how over time do they create a story that they can kind of live with, right? That can make sense to them. And so and for me, that in many ways is where I see success, right? Where over time they've created a way of kind of telling their origin stories and staying together. And many of them do stay together.
Any questions? Please raise your hand. Oh, we will be right at the front.
Okay, I know it's Haley's husband, but I need a name.
It's Blake.
Blake, okay.
So kind of in the same vein of the questions everyone's been asking, do you find that there was a large disparity between the number of these marriages who were out of, convenience for the immigration versus an actual, if you want to call it affection or love or anything like that? And which way would it lean, if so?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, Blake asks a great question about the real benefits of these relationships, and the couples are not immune to that knowledge. And so very often, what I see at least, is them pushing back at the narrative, and will essentially point to other couples where that's the case, but it's not their own. So if we think about Lala and Morris, for example, Lala, and I was able to spend some time interviewing her, but she also has a memoir, and there are all kinds of papers, and you see, and I should really acknowledge the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. All of the images that you've seen today, with the exception of the Algonquin, are from the museum. But Lala would talk about, well, there are these other couples that were like this, but, Morris and I, da-da-da-da-da-da. And indeed, she met Morris because Morris ran the DP camp where she lived. She was trying to come to the United States, and Morris allegedly says to her, "You're so pretty and young, you should just meet a soldier and go to the US like a war bride." And then, 2 days later, he shows up and asks her out on a date. So people were very clear about the strategies, and they often spent a lot of time, in their materials making clear that that may have been other people, but for them, right, it was love. And that's partly why those stories of how they meet, for me, become so important, because they often would say to me, "I met her and she was a vision. Everybody else was lying on the ground and there were bodies, but she, right, she could," in the case of Gerda Klein, right, she could quote Goethe, right, she was unlike anybody else. Well, we have interviews of the soldier who accompanies Kurt, and right, he doesn't remember, one woman as being a vision and quoting Goethe and being, much prettier than all the rest, right? He remembers the bodies and the pallets and the destruction. And of course he does, because that's his memory, right? And so this question about like how they deal with that migration piece is part of it, because they're able to immigrate, and that's to get out of Europe. I mean, they don't want to be stuck in the DP camps. They would much rather get to the US, Britain, or Canada, and particularly for women. It is single women, that's not easy. The assumption is that they are going to be a burden to the state. And so for Lala and Morris, or for Gerda and Kurt, or for Abe and Sala, right? All of these marriages bring these women to the country of origin for the military personnel.
Well, thank you again so very much.
Thank you.
So Robin, I want to thank you for being here tonight, but also, this year marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation. For many in Robin's book, that moment in 1945. Thank you for bringing it very poignantly and movingly into something personal that we can relate to. Incredible story. Robin will be signing copies of her books over to my right in front of the Higgins boat. If you're not sure, that's a Higgins boat right there, just checking. And then I'd like to invite everyone, if you're interested, please join us across the street at Kilroy's Bar in the Higgins Hotel for a continued conversation with Robin and Haley. Kilroy's will be offering extended happy hour until 9 p.m. tonight. Just had to specify that. Now, please mark your calendars for our next Jenny Craig Institute Meet the Author program. It'll be on Saturday, April 5th, with author Sonia Purnell, who'll be here to discuss her newest book, Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's astonishing life of power, seduction, and intrigue. That's Saturday, April 5th in Stage Door Canteen, about the life of Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, who became a powerful force in the Allied war effort. And then on April 15th, we'll have Jan Davis. Jan's an author and astronaut, speaking on her book, Airborne. In Airborne, Jan tells the story of her father as a World War II pilot and how his actions encouraged her to take flight herself. So kind of another neat story to help us relate to that. And finally, I want to thank everyone for coming here tonight. Extend the offer to join us across the street over there. But let's give a round of applause for Haley and Robin tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.